They saw you cry once, and it changed the way they looked at you. Not because the tears made you seem fragile. Not because they suddenly thought you needed rescuing. Something much more unsettling happened inside them. For the first time, they saw the cost of the strength you had been showing everyone else. And that is why the first card here matters so much. The Hanged Man. Symbolically, this card is about suspension, holding still, enduring, seeing life from an angle nobody else can see. And in your image, the card itself appears reversed, which makes the symbolism even sharper for this story. Someone who has been holding on for too long, trying to stay composed while something inside is begging to be released. That is what they witnessed. Maybe you thought you recovered quickly. Maybe you wiped your face, changed the subject, straightened your voice, and went right back to being the person everyone expects you to be. But they caught the second before the mask came back, and that second stayed with them. Because suddenly, all the little things they had ignored started rearranging themselves in their mind. The way you say, "I'm fine," too fast. The way you help everyone before dealing with yourself. The way you disappear when things get heavy. The way you make pain look like tiredness and exhaustion look like responsibility. They realized they had mistaken endurance for ease. That realization was the first crack, but it still was not the thing that snapped. The deeper shift came when they understood something almost unbearable. You may have been carrying far more than anyone around you knew, and you had become so practiced at carrying it that even they had believed the performance. The Hanged Man becomes the perfect symbol for that moment. Not helplessness, not weakness. A person suspended between what they feel and what they allow others to see. And when they saw that gap for themselves, something protective woke up. Quietly, immediately, permanently. They did not look at your tears and think, "You are weak." They looked at them and thought, "How long have you been doing this alone?" And that question has not left them since. Because what happened inside them after that question is where this story gets much more intense. Stay with me, because the next card reveals what that realization turned into, and why their behavior changed afterward. And the next card is the Knight of Cups, which changes the energy completely. Because if the Hanged Man was the moment they understood what they had been seeing, the Knight of Cups is what happened when that understanding began moving. Toward you. This card is emotional, yes. But more importantly here, it represents someone who is no longer willing to remain a distant observer of what they feel. They started paying attention. Not dramatically. Not in a way that would immediately make you realize something had changed. In fact, you may have missed it completely. But they notice your voice now. They notice when it gets softer around certain people. When your answers become shorter. When that easy version of you suddenly becomes careful. They notice when somebody asks something from you and you say yes before you have even given yourself time to decide whether you want to. They notice the pause afterward. That tiny hesitation. The one you probably assume nobody catches. They do. And the Knight of Cups matters because this is where concern becomes participation. The Hanged Man made them stop and reconsider everything. This card shows what happened next. They began moving closer emotionally. They began checking, watching, remembering. Who leaves you exhausted after every conversation? Who somehow always needs something from you? Which situations make you unusually quiet afterward? How quickly you minimize your own tiredness when somebody asks if you are okay. Especially that one. I'm okay. They hear it differently now. Before, they might have accepted it because you sounded convincing. Now they listen to how fast you say it. They watch what happens to your face afterward. They notice whether you immediately redirect the conversation toward them. And this is not because they suddenly believe you cannot handle your own life. It is almost the opposite. They realized you can handle so much that people may never recognize when they have asked too much of you. including you. That is what unsettled them. Because once somebody sees how much effort goes into appearing unaffected, they cannot completely unsee it. So now there are moments when you think nobody is paying attention, and they are. When you go quiet across the room. When your energy changes after somebody says something. When you smile because explaining why something bothered you would take more energy than pretending it did not. They see more than they used to. But that is only the surface of what changed. Because they are not just noticing you anymore. They have started noticing the pattern around you. And very quietly, they are beginning to identify exactly which people and which situations make you become smaller than you were a moment before. And that is exactly why the Two of Wands matters here. Because this card is not about reacting. It is about stepping back far enough to see the pattern. To look at what has already happened and realize it was never just one moment. One comment, one favor, one uncomfortable interaction. They have started rewinding things. Conversations they barely thought about before are coming back differently now. The joke somebody made at your expense that you laughed at, before anyone could decide whether it had gone too far. The time someone interrupted you, and you simply stopped talking. The favor you agreed to, while already exhausted. The responsibility that somehow became yours because everyone knew you would handle it if nobody else did. And especially the apologies. They notice those now. How quickly you say sorry when somebody else is uncomfortable. How you soften your words after telling the truth. How you start explaining yourself the second another person reacts badly, even when you have done absolutely nothing wrong. Before, these things looked separate. Now they do not. That is the Two of Wands in this story. Distance. Perspective. Someone looking across the whole landscape instead of staring at one isolated moment. And what they are beginning to understand is that your discomfort does not always announce itself. Sometimes it looks like politeness. Sometimes it looks like patience. Sometimes it looks like you smiling and saying, "It's okay," before anyone has even apologized. So they cannot rely only on whether you complain. They know better now. Not because they think everyone around you is dangerous. Not because they are becoming suspicious of every person who speaks to you. This is not paranoia. It is recognition. They have seen that you are extremely good at making other people comfortable while you are uncomfortable. And once they realized that, they started watching the exchange instead of just watching your reaction. Who takes? Who assumes? Who speaks over you? Who only seems to notice your generosity when they need access to it? Who leaves you carrying the emotional mess after they walk away feeling perfectly fine? But there is one pattern that bothers them more than all the others. You protect people from realizing they hurt you. You make it easier for them. You laugh so they do not feel embarrassed. You forgive before they have to sit with what they did. You say, "Don't worry about it," while you are still very clearly carrying it. And suddenly they understand why some people keep crossing the same lines. There are never any consequences. Because you absorb them. That realization does something to them. Something heavier than concern. Something much harder to keep quiet. And that is where the Page of Swords reversed comes in. Because this is not loud anger. It is the kind that gets very quiet, very observant, very precise. They are not looking for someone to blame. They are not waiting for an excuse to start a fight. But something in them has become deeply uncomfortable with how easily certain things have been allowed to happen around you. Especially because now they can see your part in hiding the damage. Not causing it, hiding it. There is a difference. They remember the times you suddenly became distant and they assumed you needed space. The conversations you changed before anybody could ask what was really wrong. The smile you used after somebody said something that clearly landed harder than you wanted anyone to know. The way you could be hurt by someone and then, somehow, still end up helping them an hour later. And some of those memories bother them now. Because they were there. Maybe not for everything, but enough. Enough to realize there were moments when they heard, "I'm fine," and let themselves believe it, because believing you was easier than looking underneath it. That is where the guilt comes in. They wonder whether they should have asked again. Whether they should have noticed sooner. Whether there were times you were quietly asking to be seen, without ever actually saying the words. The reversed Page of Swords carries that tension perfectly here, seeing something clearly after the fact, and having nowhere comfortable to put that knowledge. So the anger stays controlled. But it is there, not at you. Never at you for feeling what you felt. They are angry at how much you apparently had to normalize before anyone thought to question it. Angry that being the strong one somehow became permission for people to assume you would absorb whatever they handed you. And maybe most of all, angry that you learned to help them do it. By minimizing, by forgiving quickly, by keeping everything smooth, because their protective instinct is changing. At first it was simple. I don't want anyone to hurt you. Now it is becoming something more complicated. I don't want you believing you have to accept being hurt just to keep everyone else comfortable. And that changes the entire situation. Because suddenly, protecting you is not only about noticing what other people do. Sometimes they are beginning to realize the person they may have to interrupt is much closer to you than anyone else. Much closer. And you probably are not expecting who it is. And the answer is you. Or more precisely, the part of you that has become so accustomed to enduring things that you sometimes stop noticing when endurance has turned against you. That is why the Five of Swords reversed matters here. Because in this story, this card is not about defeat. It is about recognizing the moment you no longer need to keep participating in something that costs you too much. And they are starting to recognize those moments before you do. They see how your strength can become a trap. You can stay longer because you know you will survive it. You can understand someone's behavior so well that you explain away what they did to you. You can carry something alone because asking for help somehow feels more uncomfortable than carrying the weight. And when something hurts, you recover. Fast enough that everyone assumes it must not have been that serious. Sometimes even you. That is what they are watching now. So when you automatically say yes, they may be the person who pauses and asks, "Do you actually want to do that?" Not accusing you, not deciding for you. Just creating enough space for you to hear your own answer before your instinct to accommodate someone else takes over. When you start apologizing for something that was not yours to apologize for, they notice. When you are clearly uncomfortable somewhere, they may suddenly give you an easy reason to leave. And when you say, "I'm just tired," they do not always let the conversation end there anymore. Because they know tired can mean tired. But they also know what else you have hidden inside that word. The reversed Five of Swords makes this especially important. There is a difference between protecting your peace and surrendering yourself to keep the peace. They can see that difference now. And they do not want to become another person who tells you what to do. That would miss the entire point. They want you to remember that you are allowed to want something different. Allowed to say no before resentment. Allowed to ask for help before collapse. Allowed to admit something hurt before you have completely recovered from it. They are not trying to take your strength away. They are trying to stop watching you use that strength to abandon yourself. And once they understood that, something else changed too. Because when certain people come around you now, this person cannot pretend not to see what happens. The shift in their face, the silence. The way they suddenly start paying very close attention. And lately, it has become almost impossible to hide. And this is where the Nine of Swords changes the meaning of what you are seeing. Because now the protectiveness has started showing on the outside. Not through confrontation. Through restraint, you may notice them become quieter when somebody makes a joke at your expense. They do not laugh as quickly anymore. Sometimes they do not laugh at all. They just watch, not the person who made the comment. You. They are looking for that tiny change they have learned to recognize. The expression that disappears too fast. The laugh that sounds slightly forced. The moment you decide, almost instantly, that keeping things comfortable matters more than letting anyone know something bothered you. And if a conversation starts cornering you, they may suddenly redirect it. Change the subject. Ask you something. Create an opening. Nothing dramatic enough for everyone else to understand what just happened. But you might. Or maybe you have noticed them standing closer lately when the atmosphere changes. Not touching you. Not claiming you. Just making their presence harder to ignore. The Nine of Swords is important here, because underneath all of this controlled behavior is a mind that has started thinking much further ahead. They remember who always seems to need something from you. They remember who explains themselves strangely after crossing a line. They remember which people leave you defending them afterward. So when somebody gives you an explanation that does not quite make sense, this person may ask another question, calmly, and then another, not to embarrass anyone. They simply no longer accept the first version of events as easily as they used to. You could mistake this for moodiness, maybe even jealousy. You might wonder why they suddenly seem serious around someone they used to tolerate without a problem. But what changed is simpler than that. They have developed a line, and they know exactly where it is now. They can watch you struggle. They know you are capable. They can watch you deal with difficult situations, make hard decisions, even get frustrated. But watching someone deliberately make you feel smaller and then expecting you to smile so everybody else can move on? That is different. Something in them refuses to participate in that anymore. And that refusal has become very difficult to hide. But here is what makes the Nine of Swords even more revealing. Their reaction is not actually being driven by anger as much as you might think. The anger is there. Underneath it, though, is something far more vulnerable. Fear. Because after seeing you break for that one brief moment, they realized just how much could be happening inside you before anyone ever knows something is wrong. And that is why the Queen of Swords matters so much here. Because this card is not afraid of the truth, even when the truth is uncomfortable. Even when it changes the way you understand someone. And the truth they are sitting with now is this. What frightened them was never the fact that you cried. It was how quickly you stopped, how fast you gathered yourself, how immediately you tried to become readable again. Calm, fine, manageable. They watched you put everything back where it belonged so nobody else would have to deal with what had just happened. And that scared them more than the tears did. Because suddenly they understood how easy it might be for you to disappear emotionally without actually going anywhere. You could still answer messages, still show up, still help, still smile, and nobody would necessarily know that some part of you had quietly stopped reaching outward. That is what the Queen of Swords represents here. Seeing past appearances, refusing to confuse composure with safety. They are not afraid because they think you are fragile. They are afraid because they know you are strong enough to survive something without telling anyone how much it is costing you. Strong enough to withdraw without making a scene. Strong enough to stop asking. Strong enough to decide, quietly, that explaining yourself is no longer worth the effort. And they do not want to realize too late that you have been hurting alone again. So their idea of protecting you is changing. It is not just, how do I stop people from hurting you? Because they know that is impossible. Life will still happen. People will still disappoint you. Things will still reach you. The question becoming more important to them is different. How do I become someone you do not have to hide it from? That is much more personal. because it means they cannot just stand beside you when somebody else crosses a line. They have to become safe enough for you to tell the truth before everything is already over. Safe enough for silence, for the unfinished sentence, for the moment when you do not know how to explain why something hurts. They want you to know that you do not have to clean yourself up emotionally before coming near them. But there is a problem with that. You cannot ask someone to stop hiding while you remain completely hidden yourself, and they are beginning to understand that too. Which means the next part of this changes them just as much as it changes you, because protecting you is about to require something they may find much harder than confronting anyone else. They are going to have to let you see them too, and that is where the Two of Pentacles becomes important, because this card is about balance, but not the effortless kind, the kind you have to keep choosing again and again. And for them, that means learning how to be close to what you feel without trying to control it. That may not come naturally. They might ask, "Are you okay?" You say yes. And normally, that would have been the end of it. Now there may be a pause. Then, more quietly, "Are you actually okay?" Not because they want to force something out of you. Because they have learned the difference between asking the question and making enough room for an honest answer. Sometimes they may even go first. Tell you something they usually keep to themselves. Admit that they were worried. Admit that they did not know what to say. Maybe even tell you that seeing you cry affected them more than they expected. And that matters, because suddenly you are not being examined. You are being met. The Two of Pentacles represents that exchange here. Not one person carrying everything while the other watches. Not one person becoming the strong one every single time. Something more mutual. So if you go quiet, they may stop rushing to fill the silence. If you cannot explain what is wrong, they may stop asking you to package it neatly. If tears come again, they are beginning to understand that the goal is not to make them disappear as quickly as possible. It is to make sure you do not feel ashamed for having them. They may still be awkward. They may say the wrong thing. They may look unusually serious because they are thinking far too hard about getting it right. But underneath that awkwardness is something very clear. They want to become trustworthy, not impressive, not heroic, trustworthy. Because seeing you cry did not make them think, "I need to save you." It made them think, "I never want you to believe you have to hide this from me." And that is where the title of this whole story starts making sense. Something did snap. But it was not their self-control. It was their willingness to stay emotionally neutral. They cannot do that anymore. Your well-being has become personal to them. They have chosen a side. Yours. And the final cards show what protecting you actually means now, because it is much more intense than simply standing up for you. And somehow much more tender too. And that is why the Page of Wands reversed is so important here. Because normally, this card carries a restless kind of fire. Energy without direction. Feeling something strongly without always knowing what to do with it. But reversed. In this story, that fire stops scattering. It concentrates. And that is what has happened to them. The Hanged Man showed them what you had been enduring. The Knight of Cups made them move closer. The Two of Wands made them look at the pattern. The Swords forced them to see what was unfair, what frightened them, and what they could no longer ignore. And now all of that feeling has somewhere to go. Toward one very clear decision. They refuse to become another person who benefits from you pretending to be okay. That is the mission. Not controlling your life. Not deciding who you can speak to. Not standing between you and every difficult experience as though you cannot handle yourself. They know you can. That was never the issue. The issue is that you can handle so much that people become comfortable letting you handle too much. And they are no longer comfortable with that. So if your discomfort appears before your explanation does, they believe the discomfort. If you need help, They do not want you reaching a breaking point before you are allowed to receive it. If somebody keeps taking advantage of the fact that you are understanding, forgiving, patient, or soft-hearted, this person notices. And they remember. But they also respect that your life is still yours. Your decisions, your voice, your boundaries. Their protection is not meant to replace those things. It is meant to stand beside them. That is what makes this different. Because around this person, the performance is becoming unnecessary. The quick, "I'm fine." The smile that returns before you are ready. The mask sliding back into place because you think everyone needs you composed. They saw what existed underneath it once. And they did not turn away. Maybe they believe that was the moment they became protective of you. Maybe they think the tears created all of this. But I do not think that is what happened. I think the tears revealed something that had already been forming. The attention was already there. The attachment was already there. The instinct to move closer was already there. Your tears simply removed their ability to pretend it meant less than it did. And there is one final piece to this. Because once someone has seen you that clearly and chosen not to look away, the relationship cannot return to exactly what it was before. Something between you has already changed, even if neither of you has said it out loud yet. And that is why the Empress feels like the right final card. Because after everything else, this is not a card about fighting harder. It is about what happens when someone decides your softness should not always come with a cost. Care. Presence. A place where you do not have to earn tenderness by reaching your limit first. That is what has changed between you. They still see your strength. They still know you are capable of handling difficult things, making your own decisions, and surviving moments that would overwhelm other people. They have not forgotten any of that, but they no longer use your strength as an excuse to stay distant. That is the difference. Before, they could hear, "I'm fine," and assume you would tell them if you needed something. Now they know you might not. Before, your independence looked like proof that you wanted to handle everything yourself. Now they understand that sometimes independence is simply what happens when someone becomes very good at having no other option. They mistook endurance for ease once. They will not do it again. And the Empress brings the entire story back to that first moment. You crying, that brief second before you wiped everything away, before your voice steadied, before the mask returned. They saw you there. Not the composed version, not the person who could explain everything neatly afterward. You. And they cannot unknow that version of you now. So protecting you becomes something quieter than you might have expected. Not hovering, not demanding answers, not treating every bad day like an emergency. It is asking and actually listening. Noticing without making you feel watched. Standing up for you without taking your voice away. Giving you room without disappearing. Staying when there is nothing to fix, that is. The Empress here, making space for something vulnerable without treating it as something shameful. And maybe that is why this changed them so permanently. They started with one question. How long have you been doing this alone? But somewhere along the way, that question became a decision. As long as they are close enough to matter, they do not want alone to be your automatic answer anymore. Something snapped when they saw you cry. Not because they discovered you could break, because they finally understood how often you had been putting yourself back together without letting anyone see the pieces. And they cannot comfortably stand by and watch that happen anymore. They cannot promise you will never cry again. That was never the mission. The mission is simpler. The next time you do, you will not have to hide it. And you will not have to carry what comes after it alone.